are these people?
This one, we've kind of held on for the last 2 weeks. We were not live last week, but it still applies to, still what's happening because there's definitely been a lot of talk about it. So as you guys might know, President Donald Trump signed executive order, not sure, forgot when, but essentially dismantling USAID. So how's that important? It's tied to, the way I'm going to say it is charity, because that's what it is, overseas. And what we're going to feature about is Africa. So we want to be as nuanced as possible. So we want to give both takes on how funding to the continent is important. There is some good that comes out of the funding, but we're also going to hear from Africans themselves who believe that not really necessary given the resources that are in Africa that are unfortunately not sourced properly, that they really don't need the aid along with other reasons. So we're going to hear from both sides tonight.
Okay.
Look at my African American over here. Look at him. Are you the greatest? Do you know what I'm talking about? Okay.
What?
So I guess this is from Substack.
Okay.
But the blog is called The Bulwark.
Coming to a Substack newsletter near you.
So this blog was written by, is kept by Holly Berkley Fletcher. And she writes what USAID's dismantling looks like on the ground in Africa. Locals in Malawi and Kenya who worked with the agency faced stalled development, canceling programming, and shortages of life-saving supplies. I think we will forget America is even there. So this is what she's reporting on the ground in those countries. So just as context, the names that she is referring to these Africans are aliases, obviously to protect the identities as far as the work down there. So just to keep that in mind. John is old enough to remember the dark days when AIDS ravaged his country and his family. Living in Malawi, he has seen close up the difference made by life-saving work of PEPFAR, which is administered in large part through the U.S. Agency of International Development. For him, the American government has been a steady, sustaining presence for many years for a multiplicity of programs under the umbrella of USAID. He had believed it was a relationship of mutual benefit to Malawi and America. Now, in the wake of the Trump administration's dismantling of USAID, he wonders what will happen to his country. He worries the deadly past might revisit. We are so scared we might see people dying like that again, he told me on the phone this week. John's work brings him into contact with many USAID employees and projects in Malawi. In particular, he knows that USAID brings badly needed development and services to rural areas, which in Malawi, as in many other African countries, are chronically underserved by their governments. Wealth, power, and influence tend to be concentrated in the cities. Specifically, he describes to me the importance of USAID educational programming for rural children. The agency has built rural schools with science labs and libraries, both rare in those settings. John thinks support for rural girls' education is especially vital in a country where many families don't prioritize educating their daughters. He says USAID programming has ensured girls don't miss school during their periods because they lack feminine products, a common problem for girls in Africa. USAID had focused on the girl child, John says. They focused on so many problems facing girls in rural areas.
I mean, they do a lot more than that. But I mean, this is the Bulwark, so it's going to not be great, and they're probably going to defend USAID to the nth degree. But definitely some issues for that, as many have brought up.
But what I do appreciate is that, especially being there, these are issues that are apparent.
Oh, yeah. Well,
that we don't
used
think
to be
about.
One of the only ways Africa got aid was to claim it was for AIDS research. you know? So.
And even that is questionable. So.
Yes. Yeah.
I don't think that'll be a story we can report because YouTube, but you can go online and find out. That's all I'm going to say. And we're just going to leave it there. But anyway, but then the cuts came. The students in the villages may not know what is happening, but they are affected. Over the last few weeks, John has witnessed the sheer chaos of USAID's dismantling in one of the world's most aid-dependent countries. The U.S. government provided $350 million in aid across multiple sectors last year, equivalent to 13% of Malawi's national budget. Its permanent cessation would not only be a humanitarian catastrophe, but an economic one. John's own employment and that of many Malawians he knows is in danger. He tells me people report to work each day not knowing if they still had a job. Everyone looks sad because no one knows what will happen, he says. We may pretend we are okay, but we are not okay. Donald Trump and Elon Musk have repeatedly given as a rationale for gun USAID the prevention of waste, fraud, and abuse. But John expects Malawi will see, as it's already seeing, more waste and corruption. He mentions 2 educational projects that have stopped midstream, leaving half-finished buildings standing idle, construction materials unused, and boxes of books and computer tablets unattended. He fears that without the USAID administration, these supplies will vanish into the ether of the corruption that is all too common in Africa to the benefit of the politically well-connected, if they haven't already. Where is the cement and other supplies? Still there? Stolen? Who knows? He said. Similar concerns were raised by a Kenyan friend, Jane, a home health nurse employed by her county government. County governments manage Kenya's public health system, which distributes antiretrovirals and other medications from afar. Kenya is another country that sees large amounts of USAID programming based on not just on need, but on its status as a stable, democratic, and economically dynamic nation and a regional base for multiple NGOs that operate on the continent. In 2024, USAID invested $359 million in Kenya. Jane's workdays began by going to a government dispensary to pick up food packets and antiretroviral and tuberculosis drugs before visiting the homebound. She says her job has always been made difficult by corruption and mismanagement in the county government. Sometimes there is no food available, and she is often dipped into her own scarce funds to provide for her patients. When you go see a patient and they haven't food, what do? She told me via text. We even seek help from churches. But she's always had access to needed drugs until the last few weeks. She doesn't know with certainty as to why she can no longer reliably receive them. According to a UN report, Kenya should have enough antiretroviral drugs on hand to cover the need for another few months. But Jane already sees a connection between the shortages she's experiencing and the chaos surrounding USAID. She suspects that wealthy and well-connected people are hoarding them in anticipation of them running out. We will lose a lot of patients that we're not supposed to, she messaged me. I asked John about another Trump administration talking point regarding the dismantling of USAID, one I've heard in my own evangelical circles, that USAID aggressively promotes an LGBTQ agenda for its overseas aid. He seemed completely befuddled. I haven't seen anything like that, he said. You know, here in Malawi, most people are not comfortable with this issue, so if there is money going to that, it must be a very small amount. In the educational sector, which John is the most familiar with, the only thing he's seen that might be remotely related is a book that teaches children tolerance for those with HIV. He does not consider those books a problem. They're trying to promote equity, empathy, and coexisting, he said. There is USA programming aimed at supporting LGBTQ communities in Africa, but understanding the context of extreme discrimination far worse than what you see in the United States is essential, as it is for assessing the kind of gender-based programming John told me about. What many Americans might consider EDI, or an LGBTQ agenda in Africa, might be advocating and providing for the basic human rights of people who face severe marginalization, legal persecution, and/or violence, including girls, women, LGBTQ people, and disabled. In some countries, USAID-funded clinics might be the only ones that offer any kind of medical care to LGBTQ people. And I can actually speak to this a little bit more. Not so much LGBTQ, but definitely disabilities, especially special needs. Like, because the idea is like, if you like, there is no care for generally if you had, especially if you had severe special needs there, like you're just considered trash and you're tossed aside. So the idea, like, I was very fortunate to volunteer at an organization that offered care to their special needs students, which was, you know, in Uganda, which at the time was pretty almost revolutionary. I hate saying it in that way, but it was, because, you know, in Africa generally, unfortunately, the idea is like, if you're special needs, you're cursed and nobody should have anything to do with you. So if anything, I would argue, if you're going to look at it from that standpoint, is, you know, lack of aid will truly affect. It's kind of what we're talking about in terms of the Department of Ed being dismantled or trying to be, you know, care for, you know, special needs students. Very ironic that they say they want to, you know, cut waste, quote unquote, but the very people who will benefit, who otherwise may not get an education, or at least a fair one, or services, are not going to necessarily get it, you know, depending on the aid that will be cut. So, but I think John is right. Like, you know, like LGBT issues is very taboo in most places in Africa. So I haven't seen that at all. At least the last time I went, which was in 2019. Like,
great documentary by Stephen Fry, who's got plenty of issues himself, but he went like did a whole thing on gay communities around the world, how they're persecuted and how they deal with that. And like, you know, he went to Africa and all those like radio shows and all that stuff that, you know, promote anti gay rights stuff over there. He like actively went on one of those shows and like debated. It was a decent episode for sure. People should go check that out.
Right.
But
I do also think, like,
well, yeah, there's,
in terms of like HIV, I think especially here, it's somewhat viewed as, oh, it's the gay disease.
Yeah.
You know, which I think is kind of the implication in Africa. If you have HIV, when often than not, it's through heterosexual relationships.
Yeah, a lot of times rape
through R or DV. So,
correct.
You know, so kind of like that context is often very missed.
Well, there's the, and this could be misinformation. Like, it could just be fear mongering stuff. But I remember hearing something along the lines of men were taught that like sex with virgins would cure them of it, you know?
Yes.
So
yeah,
I don't know how accurate that actually is, but I did hear that.
No, it's accurate.
So,
no, it's accurate. But I think mostly it's still the idea of like, now keep in mind, and we talked about this, there's a lot of evangelical, I would argue, consent.
Oh, and plenty of weird stuff over there with that.
Many countries of Africa in general. So it's the idea of like, you know, you have to wait till you're married and all this kind of stuff. But kind of the underlying belly is that people will have, you know, premarital sex and not necessarily protect themselves. And even with that, the idea of getting condoms or any kind of safe sex protection is hard to get.
I find interesting too, because, and this is partly the issue with USAID, right? Is that they mix all this stuff that's theoretically on paper very good, right? And things like sex education there's a article out, I think it's in Mint Press right now, about Israel infiltrating sexual education programs, right? And funding them to the nth degree and putting their own curriculums in there. And, you know, that's also happening here, right? And we all known for years that USAID is an extension of things like the NED, right? That, you know, fund things for more reasons than just beneficial, right? A lot of times it's control and clandestine operations there as well. So that is part of it.
Right.
So, but now all that stuff that they were doing overtly in places like Syria and with the white helmets and things like that, like now that's being brought into a more private situation, right? Which they're looking to privatize almost everything, but more bringing this into the State Department, so it's more cloak and dagger for the most part.
Right.
So, there's definitely some fear mongering on both sides of this for sure.
Right.
So, but I know you brought some stuff that like pushes back on USAID being helpful to Africa.
I'll talk about that in a few minutes. But let me finish this. I think I have a page of this left, or maybe two. But to continue with HIV, efforts to combat and treat HIV disproportionately help women, as the spread of HIV is closely tied to gender-based violence, which almost half of African women experience, a rate almost unseen anywhere else in the world. There's a danger that even if most USAID programming is resumed, projects like the ones Chan told me about aimed at girls might be labeled DEI and permanently shuttered.
Yeah.
Any programming to assist LGBTQ communities seems a dead letter. I asked John about the broader discussion over aid and dependency, which is a vigorous debate in Africa itself. We'll get more to that in a minute. Critics argue that aid disincentivizes better governments and point out the meager return in economic growth. Even when dispersed through NGOs, they say, foreign aid provides services for which governments can take credit, or at least for which they can avoid blame and accountability from their citizens. We agree we cannot continue to be beggars, John says, but the people who feel the most pain from aid cuts are the innocent. The politicians will find a way, but not the innocent child in the village. Certainly, a wholesale overnight resuscitation does nothing but endanger those who are already vulnerable. John is also bewildered as to why America will see an advantage to itself in ending USAID. USAID made America to be everywhere. Now it's like the lights are turned off, he says. I think we will forget America is even here. Does Trump not know the consequences of this? I mean, Trump don't care. So, John, not your real name, but you're giving Trump way too much credit. Like you actually feel that he actually gives a damn. Like you don't. But yeah, as I said earlier, we want to give some nuance. So there is obviously some benefit, to having USAID in these countries. But now we're going to get to, I don't particularly like using them, but they do bring up some good points in foreign policy. But where they talk about the end of USAID is an opportunity for Africa. This is written by Ebenezer Obadare, a senior fellow for Africa Studies at the Council of Foreign Relations. So he argues that reducing foreign aid can help end dependency and promote African agency. What does he mean by that? We will read now. So amid rising concern about China's and Russia's growing influence in Africa, a corresponding apprehension about the United States' capacity to hold its own in the region, President Donald Trump's executive order pausing all U.S. foreign assistance funded by or through our State Department and U.S. Agency for International Development has certainly muddied the waters further. Whether or not the legal challenge to the directive is ultimately successful, a U.S. federal judge has ruled that the president overstepped his constitutional authority. The apparent determination of the Trump administration to make all foreign assistance align with U.S. foreign policy under the America First agenda, which what does that mean concerning how he's been more Israel first?
Yeah.
But whatever. Suggests that we are entering a new era with new rules of engagement in both U.S.-Africa relations and U.S. development assistance in Africa. This shift presents an opportunity for African countries to reset their relationship with foreign aid, as well as rethink the moral and philosophical underpinnings of African development. Most of the immediate reaction to the president order has focused on the implications for U.S. geostrategic interests in the region where, since the Russian invasion of Ukraine in early 2022, Washington seems to be on the back foot. Seen from this perspective, shuttering U.S. aid signals an intention to retreat when the United States should be pressing forward and seeking to remain in the good books of its allies. That I kind of disagree with, for obvious reasons, given that the United States has no intention to be allies with Africa. It only tends to be allies with Africa
its
in
resources.
terms of what they can get from them. And we talked about that regarding Global Citizen, that organization that John Legend is affiliated with. So it's not all good intentions. And I'll share more of my thoughts on this in a few minutes, but yeah, that's where I kind of disagree with that idea. It also suggests a readiness to surrender the diplomatic initiative to geopolitical competitors such as China and Russia, as well as a contrary of middle powers, including Turkey and the United Arab Emirates, that sense an opportunity in Africa. Furthermore, critics have argued that dismantling USAID is self-defeating, especially insofar as it signals U.S. abandonment for the soft power approach that has seen the continent, you mean, not country, you ask, make gains in the battles of hearts and minds that is invariably part and parcel of international diplomacy. Both of these criticisms have merit. With an average annual disbursement of about $23 billion annually since 2001, USAID has been the face and vehicle of American soft power since its establishment at the height of the Cold War, supporting initiatives in areas including vaccination and HIV prevention programs and support for civil society groups. It stands to reason then that the ripples from this evisceration will reverberate far and wide. Likewise, the most likely beneficiaries in Africa will be China and Russia. Over the years, and more so since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, neither has been particularly shy in its objective of going toe-to-toe with the United States in Africa.
Yeah, that whole paragraph is iffy.
Yeah. Again, not a fan of this publication. I mean, I'm only reading it because we have to hear a different side.
Sure.
There is some good parts. But as you guys can tell, this is very skewed in terms of, and again, like the idea of Russia and China becoming infiltrated, that's been happening, sir. Like, China's already made a presence there, given the Belt and Road Initiative, which even with that, as I said in the show, I have issues with. But yeah, let's continue. If their immediate aim is to curtail the U.S. footprint in the region, the long-term goal is unmistakable: to undercut the Western alliance with a view towards maligning liberal democracy, as Moscow's reported investigation of coups across the Sahel, plus its continued material and moral support for the various juntas, attests. Similarly, China's celebrated Belt and Road Initiative and the growing number of Confucius Institutes scattered across the continent. As of July 2020, 61 of them have been established in 46 countries, are nothing but a smokescreen for the spread of Beijing's preferred ideology.
Yeah,
except this is kind of
memos from the State Department from foreign policy.
Right.
So
in other words, for people, this is kind of like a snob at communism, it sounds like.
Yeah.
Like communism bad, which I would argue China isn't really communist anymore. So
yes and no. It's kind of a mix of things.
Right. However, it remains to be seen whether either has the financial muscle or, significantly, the appetite to cover the anticipated shortfall of the U.S. withdrawal of aid. Despite all of these criticisms, the most important consideration in all of this is how African countries themselves react, and crucially, whether they see Trump's administration's efforts to dismantle USAID as an opportunity to accomplish two related objectives. First, to rethink Africa's relationship to foreign aid, and second, to pose some basic questions about African development and the role of external assistance in instigating it. In other words, how can African countries make the best of a less than ideal situation? Total aid to African countries since 1960 is calculated to be in excess of $2.6 trillion. While foreign aid, especially aid for humanitarian purposes, has no doubt saved many lives, worries about its unwitting negative impact on recipient countries cannot be disregarded. While economist William Easterly has shown that more often than not, it tends to go in the wrong people, Georgetown University's Ken Apollo has argued that it robs countries of the chance to cultivate policy autonomy and helps prop up and prolong the lives of otherwise unsustainable political regimes. That I agree with, totally. Indeed, aid inflows into specific sectors of the African economy, the healthcare sector is a prominent example, has resulted in the near total disappearance of the state from such sectors. In cases where the state is historically derelict, aid programs that take over its statutory duty as payer for services render effectively ensure that the state no longer has an economic stake. While it may be true that none of this was intended, it does nothing to change the fact that reliance on aid often ends up poisoning the state-society compact in recipient countries, making the state less and less accountable even as both state and society depend more and more on a range of external agents. Recurring accusations regarding the systematic mismanagement of some of these funds, leveled not only by traditional critics of the aid regime, but also, in instructive cases, by aid groups themselves, raise the specter of foreign aid unwittingly bolstering the very elites it aims at undermining through support for pro-democracy efforts. The more autocratic the regime in question, the darker the underlying implications. A related issue is the contested status of non-governmental organizations, which are, at their best, indispensable vehicles for the circulation of transnational democratic social norms, and, at their worst, elite contractions with scant organic connection to the society at large. Over the years, several African continents have enacted laws aiming at bringing NGOs to heel. Rethinking their role in the aid development nexus at this juncture would be a useful entree into a broader and much-needed conversation on the social impact of NGOs within the larger politics of civil society, taking into account the ever-present cleavage between popular needs and elite preferences in much of post-colonial Africa. Beyond the nitty-gritty of Pacific policies is the philosophical and moral dimension of Africa's protracted quest for development. While the authenticity of much donated solicitude for Africa can hardly be faulted, legitimate questions remain about whether the region can truly achieve a breakthrough under the current epistemological regime, a cornerstone of which is foreign aid, and whether continued reliance on foreign aid in fact puts the continent in permanent jeopardy. This is not so much to deny the obvious benefits of foreign assistance, particularly humanitarian aid, as to indicate that over time, reliance on the type witnessed in a significant number of African countries is likely to create a path dependence that may be difficult to overcome.
Yeah.
Far from a new insight, the danger of aid inducing dependency, whether by weakening local capacity, eroding governmental accountability, or strengthening despotic governments against their citizens, has been a staple of scholarly and popular commentary on Africa's development challenges over the years. The writings of George Atite, I'm going to butcher out these names, I'm sorry, Damasia Moyo, Graham Hancock, and Robert Calarisi have been particularly instructive in this regard. Whether or not Trump's foreign aid freeze is overturned by the courts, the move itself affords a historic opportunity for a serious reassessment of the role of foreign aid in Africa and a consideration of deeper moral and philosophical questions pertaining to the continent's economic development. As former Liberian Works Minister W. Good Moore noted in a recent Setamorph article, there is no future for an Africa that opts to outsource its ambition. While genuine concern has been expressed about the potential impacts for Africa of the dismantling of USAID, the chance for a root and branch reassessment and reform, I would argue transformation, complete transformation, is one that the continent itself cannot afford to miss. While USAID's closure will have many painful consequences across Africa, it is also an opportunity to reopen a new chapter in U.S.-Africa relations, one in which, because it is founded upon mutual respect, the possibility of success is not directly correlated to the amount of cash involved. For African countries that have long clamored for trade over aid, it could be the prelude for a golden age of African agency. Trump has unintentionally given Africa an opportunity. The continent has nothing to lose by seizing it. That last sentence I agree with. I think inadvertently, Trump has given Africa, the continent, a green light to say fuck off to the West. Now, given what we know, what's happening in the Sahel states, Niger, Burkina Faso, of essentially, and that might be a segment we might cover last week about those states, or countries rather, basically kicking out the French colonial system. This could be a way for the continent at large to essentially say to the West, you know, fuck off. Our resources are ours, and we will know what to do with it. So the problem is, obviously, as we've also talked about, there is a lot of corruption given among many African leaders, especially in the larger countries. That's
the thing that article didn't mention at all. Really, is U.S. involvement of like U.S. funded, you know, like what's happening in the Congo and with Kigali, and you know, in very similar formats, right? A lot of this money being kind of laundered in humanitarian aid, you know, and or others that essentially gets funneled to do the bidding of the United States. So that's one
that's
thing.
Why I wanted to read this
neither of those
article in this way,
articles touched on.
especially since we've this is why I wanted to read this article in this way, because especially since what we've talked about, especially within the last few weeks, it gives kind of but I think the common misconception is, like China and Russia are trying to overtake Africa, without realizing that a lot of this aid that's coming in is an illusion in terms of the West actually really trying to overtake Africa in its resources. As you said, given what's happening in Congo, given what's happening in West Africa, especially in Nigeria, given now what's happening in East Africa with Rwanda, especially with the genocide that's happening in Congo right now, and how they're implicated in that. So, as I was saying earlier, there's a lot of African leaders who are basically puppets for the West that I would argue, for all intents and purposes, will want to have this aid continue to come in, and basically they will kiss Trump's ass in order to continue having that funding come in whatever way necessary, to continue to exploit it to the detriment of the people that actually do need it. Now, you know, that's not to say there isn't a need, but the question is, and I've said this for a long time, Africa has the resources. It's the idea of being able to manage them well, which they haven't had the opportunity to do really since the turn of the century. So,
well, and
why are they
brought
not
this
in a
lady
position where
before,
they're able to
talking about that exact kind of stuff?
So this is Dr. Africana. So she was a former ambassador of the African Union, and she was fired essentially from that position. And given what she's saying here, you can guess why. It's been a while since she's actually like dream guest if I were ever having an opportunity to interview her one day. But given as she's from Zimbabwe initially, but given her connection to the continent, let's see what she has to say regarding USAID.
Show me one country that USAID was in and education improved. Show me what country where USAID was in and healthcare improved. The social services they're bringing, it's peanuts. The American taxpayer needs to know the billions of dollars that are being given to USAID, a fraction is making it to the people. Let's look at what HIV/AIDS was used to do. We know of a program that was run out of South Africa where they actually were injecting people with the virus. The reason some of the AIDS virus spread as rapidly as it did in Southern Africa, there were some very dirty games being played on African people. They were using Africans as guinea pigs for experimental activities. Even when you look at every aspect, they're using us as guinea pigs. Yes, there is some good, a percentage of some good, but not all of it is done with good intentions. You look at agriculture, they're destroying African agriculture by introducing those GMOs. You plant your seed in one season, your soil is finished. We used to have seeds that we can use from one season to the other. The introduction of GMOs through these agencies, USAID is one of them. We are destroying Africa in a massive way. A little good is coming out, but by and large, the end result, they mean no good. They can turn around and give us an inventory and say, as long as you have been in Africa and also other parts of the world, show us your success rate. You claim you are helping governments with education and healthcare. Show us your success rate. But I also turn around and say, African governments, why do you need this little aid to assist you in providing proper healthcare, proper education? The average African government can afford to provide those services for their people. Why does such a continent that did so much to help Europe recover continue to be so poor? Let's be realistic here. Let's not talk about peanuts. Africa does not need the aid. What we need is for those who are exploiting Africa to stop. Africa has everything it needs. If Africa could have contributed as much as it did to the recovery of Europe post-World War II, why wasn't Africa equally developed? This is a wake-up call to the African leaders to take inventory of what is really happening in their countries. Do they really need the peanuts that are coming in as aid? What is really going out? If I may use the example of what happened in Niger when the government decided they were going to take over the mining of their uranium. The French companies that were mining the uranium were paying the government 80 cents a kilo for the uranium, and then turning around and selling the uranium to the rest of the world at 200 euros a kilo. So that one move from the Nigerian government to say we are now going to take ownership of our own uranium, they went from realizing about $1 billion in uranium resources to over 300 billion a year. Do you realize what I'm talking about? No amount of NGO could bring that kind of money. And this is only one mineral. Now imagine the country taking inventory of all their minerals and benefiting from their natural resources like the rest of the countries in the Western world. That is what African leaders need to look at.
Do you see that in the horizon of African leaders right now?
They're
do you see them? No. Who do you see as the standout winners of that
the
kind of
state
change?
Guys.
And who do you think is still chasing AID contracts?
Let me tell you, we need to look at what's happening in Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali. President Traore is standing up. He is saying the natural resources in Burkina Faso, they belong to the people of Burkina Faso. Niger is doing the same thing. Mali is doing the same thing. Every leader must look at what's happening in the Sahel nations to say, like anybody else, you must take care of your people. You have your natural resources. You have everything you need to take care of your people. Why do you continue to be beggars? Look at what is being brought in by not only USAID, but all the NGOs in your country. It's peanuts. It's a joke that the African leaders should continue to be beggars of peanuts when you are looking and allowing billions to get out of your country year in and year out, if not trillions, in natural resources that your people should be benefiting from. It is a wake-up call for African leaders to wake up and say, President Trump is saying, US first, America first. You too must say, your country first. Because you have everything it takes. It is a joke. It is embarrassing to see I have not seen any African leader cry over USAID living. I can tell you for a fact, the average African leader privately is celebrating the exit of USAID because they know what is really going on.
I'm not sure if that's entirely true, but I appreciate her sentiment.
Yeah.
You know, but so in a way, assuming that more African leaders take notice of what Traore is doing in Burkina Faso and actually having the balls to stand up to the West, Trump gone fucked up in Africa. But you know what? That might be bad for Trump in a sense, because...
Well, I brought you this yesterday, right? About Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger withdraw from La Francophonie, which is like, of course they did,
French
as they should.
The French speaking.
So
we'll probably read this next week, just to build off of this.
Yeah, it's pretty short.
But basically they're saying, French, get the fuck out. We want nothing to do with you. So
and it's similar to USAID in the sense that it like is meant to be promoting educational things, like the French language. So
but as a person who's been in Africa,
let me tell you, by the way, Niger, the French pronunciation of Niger, y'all can pick like an African name for your country now. I'm just saying, like, you can do that. You're allowed. You don't got to use the colonizer's name. I'm just saying. What do I know? My complexion is a little pale to be telling you, but you might give the idea a thought. I'm just saying, So, but you were saying
this is why generally, and I think a lot of people in the space have an issue with charity, quote unquote, because this is what essentially what USAID is. It's charity, because most of the money goes to the overhead, the bureaucracy, and everything. And the rest of it, whatever it remains, goes to the people, which does nothing. So, like, you can send billions and billions of dollars towards aid for these services, which are meant to do good. But, like, being over there, like, the schools are run down. Like, they barely have any textbooks, or if any, like, may have to share textbooks among several kids.
Yeah.
The curriculum is shit.
Many of our peers have outed USAID's where that funding actually goes and how it's actually spent is definitely like clandestine in nature. So, that's even on the face. We're on the face of it. Well, it's meant to do good things and give humanitarian aid. Yeah, but it doesn't most of the time. Most of the time, that has nothing to do with what it's doing. It's like a credit card for the NED.
It'd be one thing if it was meant to do good and we're seeing the results of that and actually seeing if we have the data to back it up, but we don't have that gives any. And this is kind of where, so in a sense, I think Trump is going to get some flack for this down the road, because eventually it might come to a point where they're going to be like, what the fuck are you doing? That was the only thing that can kind of tie us to the resources in Africa, you idiot. Like, that's why I can imagine like people in the administration might say, like, down the road. But for now, as Dr. Avikana has said, this can give Africa the opportunity to do inventory on themselves and being like, do we really need this aid? The little that they get in the guise of helping our countries, when they have the resources, they just have to be better managed by their own governments in order to do it.
Yeah.
So, and because, as I said, I think she's highly optimistic, and I get why she is. I not so much, given like what I've seen and knowing a lot of these leaders who do not give a shit about their people, that they'd rather take those resources for themselves or enrich their buddies or the West with it and not do anything to develop the needs of their people, especially given some of the infrastructure that are in a lot of these countries are crap anyway.
Well, so far, we've seen China and Russia with infrastructure like construction in the regions. Like, I know I know there's some possible issues.
Right, so that's where I can see where he kind of mentions in the article there, where I can see that in terms of, the West is not going to give us money. We'll just tie ourselves closer with Russia and China.
Well, I think that they've been getting actual beneficial like cooperation there. Like, it's not just completely benefiting some Eastern power. You know, like
right. But look, I can make the argument.
Yep.
Like at least with China, like they are doing shit that you can actually see.
Yeah.
So, you know,
the
again
Belt
with the
Road
Belt
Initiative,
and Road Initiative.
And more than just that, they're building power plants and all sorts of things.
Right.
So
they are doing stuff. It's just a question on the ground. How is that working? Because again, look, for everyone who talks about China, look, I've said this about China before, but like, it's not like the Chinese, at least, and this is more anecdotal from what people have told me on the ground. So this is what some of the communists who are kind of praising China that we know in our space are not saying to you. Like, what Africans have said to me on the ground is more often than not, they're not the ones who are owning the resources or the power in those positions. It's the Chinese. It's the supervisors who are Chinese. It's the bosses who are Chinese. The people who are usually overseeing the work are the Chinese, not the Africans who are living there. And the Chinese themselves are profiting off of that and sending that money back to enrich China, not to the countries that they're working in.
Yeah.
So
I don't
no
know
one in our space is going to say that to you. No one in the space is going to say that to you, but I'm going to tell you based on what people have told me down there.
Yeah.
So, like, I do want to be careful, like,
because I don't know,
and I've said this, I'm
how beneficial.
Mixed.
I've heard both stories, so you know, it's
right. But my thing is, China really should not be involved in what's going on in Africa. Russia really should not be involved in what's going. No, like first world power really should be involved in what's happening. That would be the ideal for me. That should be the ideal of what should be happening in Africa. As Dr. Avikana said, in the same way that Trump talks about America first, quote unquote, it should be insert African country here first.
Yeah, I would just like the global south to not be exploited anymore. It would be nice if they were capable of, like, which they are, of being their own power first and foremost, which if we're shifting into multipolarity, that should be one of the poles. So, you know, plenty of Pan-Africanists would agree. But yeah, I mean, definitely some interesting stuff with the USAID, and I'd like to do more research on like what USAID was actually doing in the region for sure. And I know other people have already. So but anyway,
we can definitely look into that more for, a little bit. But yeah, like I said, just giving you guys both sides, well, multi-dimensional view.
Yeah.
But talking about stories like these are why we're demonetized. So if you want to support us and be able to continue talking about stories like these, you can scan the QR code that you see on your screen, or you can go to the Ko-fi link that you see at the bottom of your screen there. And any amount, as small as $1, will help a little growing channel to be able to keep the lights on, but more importantly, to be able to continue producing the content that most people in independent media will not be willing to talk to you about. Because we are suppressing the algorithm, YouTube is not doing its job to promote us at all. So the only way that we're able to get any promotion is from you guys. So the best way, and probably the free way for you to support us, is to like, share, and subscribe to our content. And leave comments. Whether you're watching us, going to be watching after our live stream, or when we clip the segments out, let us know in the chat or in the comments, you know, what's your opinion on USA? Do you think they actually do as much good as, you know, our politicians might try to help you to believe? What do you think of Dr. Avikana's statements regarding that USA is essentially shit and not necessarily needed in Africa, that African countries need to stand on their own autonomy to help the support of their citizens without the aid? Let us know what you think in terms of that, and help us get to free K. We're getting very close. Hopefully, we'll hit that at some point this year.
Yep.
And thanks for watching.